right, thank you. I'm not gonna be offended if you get up and take a break, because you just sat for a good long time, so thank you. This is securing and scaling Asterisk with comma ilio. And then comma what? Comma ilio. So I have a pronunciation there at the bottom. Comma ilio. It's a Hawaiian word. It means to talk and to converse. And it's generally try to start out the show. Today's agenda, we'll do a quick introduction into who I am, but most of you don't care, so we'll go through that one quick. We'll talk about what is comma ilio, and a very quick history of comma ilio. Then we'll talk about the two main parts, which is security and scaling. And then my goal at the end of this is to leave a decent amount of time for just questions from the audience. It's absolutely my favorite part. No question too big, no question too small, but let's figure out how we can all use comma ilio together. Usually most people benefit from the questions. So that's absolutely my favorite part. I try to leave some time at the end. It doesn't look like we have moderators, so if anyone wants to help with time, I'll gladly accept it. And then with that, let's get into the introduction. That beautiful person on the screen is me, and then there's my wife and daughter as well. They're okay. If you would like to contact me, my contact information is qxork.com. I see people my age and older, so hopefully you appreciate the QXORK. It's all hard words or hard consonants, so when you're giving your information over the phone, you don't have to go Q as in Quebec. It's QXORK, and then everybody's happy. When you have a name like Fred with an E and an F, and so QXORK. I'm a VoIP consultant, which is everybody's favorite people are consultants. My main aspect is through LOD.com, and I'm a proud member of the Comma Ilio project. That was a lifelong goal, so I'm glad to be a part of it. In 2020, I helped start API Ban. API Ban is a free service out there provided by LOD and some sponsors, including NetSapiens, ClearIP, Jabbones, people from the community as well. And what that does is it automatically goes out, grabs IP addresses from honeypots that we have throughout the world and blocks them for you. It keeps an active list of about a week. And so if you have a internet-facing Asterisk, free PBX, or any type of SIP server, it will block IP addresses that are doing known SIP attacks. Right now, there's about 4,000 active IP addresses. There's a huge subnet of Viper VPN that has 2,000 of those IP addresses. They're just out there destroying things. And Viper VPN couldn't care less. And I'm based in the US. Okay, that was the quick part about me. What is comma ilio? Comma ilio is an open source SIP server. Anybody using comma ilio now? I love you guys. All right. For 20 plus years, comma ilio first started out as OpenSARE, and then developed into what we have now. It's module based, which means you, much like Asterisk, in that you load what you need. And so by doing that and not loading what you don't need, you keep it faster and efficient. And that's our goal. Is unlike me, it's very fast and very light. And our goal is to process a lot in a very quick amount of time, because it's SIP, it's real-time communication, right? Focus on the real, focus on time. We have over 200 modules now. There are modules in there that sometimes surprise even the most heavy users. Like what? We used to joke that comma ilio never really touched media, but we actually have a module in there that allows you to do music on hold. So we are completely open source, and there are zero paid modules, zero paid services that you can get from comma ilio. Everything we do is completely open source. When we do a new module, or when a new module is contributed, it is there for everyone to use. 100% of what we do is on GitHub. When we say it's very fast and light. 5,000 calls per second as a load balancer in stateless mode isn't anything extraordinary. I mean, that would be expected, okay? And again, let's say you had 4 gigs of RAM, we'd expect you to have about 300,000 endpoints to be able to be handled with just 4 gigs of RAM on a system. So it's fast, lightweight. For 20 years now, the first commit was 2001. The vast majority of our licensing is GPL v2. There's also some BSD in there. You know, depending on the module, there might be another thing here and there. We can do NAT handling. We excel at NAT handling. When you have NAT problems, we like to solve them. IPv6 we've had since, I mean, well over 10 years at this point. IPv4, of course. You can connect to any kind of database you can think of mostly. So the most commonly used are probably Postgres and Maria/MySQL. It's a religious war. I like Maria, but a lot of people tell me how wrong I am about that like. And I think Postgres is like the vegan of databases. You don't really know unless you tell people. We also integrate heavily with Redis, and you can use that as both configuration as well as just a real-time connector. MongoDB is very popular now, and SQLite. We have our own DB text module as well, which basically just takes as it implies, a text file and uses it as a DB. There's a spec. It's mostly just used for, you know, lack of connectivity and lab testing, things like that, so that you don't have to, you know, create a whole connector to a database, or if you're presenting for presentations or just doing some quick tests. You know, you have the same kind of things that you would pull from a database without actually connecting to the database. Kamailio itself acts as a registrar, a location server. At its heart, it's a proxy. It can do SIP redirects, and it can also become a SIP application server. This is one of my favorite slides of Kamailio, because there is just so much on it that it's almost unusable, but nonetheless, I love it. You know, my joke with people when they say I need a simple, I'm building a simple SIP solution or a simple SIP product is, yeah, I mean, none of them are ever simple, right? They're just complex, and you end up building things on top of it. I like to start off with a good foundation at Kamailio, and then everything else can build on top of a strong foundation. But as everyone, you know, yesterday, the most common reference I heard was that XKCD about that, you know, the open source with that one little product. It's the same kind of thing with SIP, right? You're gonna develop everything, and then, oh, chance SIP's going away, or this is going away. So, you know, you just gotta keep up on things. But Kamailio will work with other aspects. I think for most of the people in the room, as you start building and scaling your applications, you're gonna realize, I can't do it with just Asterisk. I can't do it with just Kamailio. I can't do it with just my database. So you need things that play well with others, and that is where Kamailio excels, in my opinion. When I said brief history, I mean brief history. Like I said, the first commits were in 2001. It started as a educational project and product, and became what was then a commercial SIP Express router. 2005, there was an open source version of it that became OpenSARE. In 2007 or so, there was some politically thinking. There was an issuance of SARE, a company in US that is no longer relevant, but they issued a cease and desist, and anything using the name SARE for copyright and registration aspects, as many of us see in business world, that happens. So there was a rebranding or a renaming of Kamailio. At the same time of that, there was also a internal division / forking, and you have Kamailio, and where it says like other forks, that's clearly OpenSIPs. So Kamailio and OpenSIPs broke. In the meantime, SIP Express router and its commercial way have become more or less decided to come back to the open source realm. Kamailio worked hard with them and created the SIP router project. So everything that had been built commercially into SARE was then rebuilt into Kamailio and released as open source. And so that's where you have Kamailio today, is a merging of the original SARE and OpenSARE into Kamailio. Like I said in the agenda, the two main aspects that you would use Kamailio for are security and scaling, right? So let's hit security. I like to think of security almost as customs or border control. As you guys, many of you guys here today have gone through our beautifully friendly border control people. But Kamailio is a good bridge and security aspect of it, and its best aspect is as a SIP edge router. So some people will say SBC. Alex Balashov, who's who's a member of the project, good friend, he's a great guy. Anyway, Alex has my favorite definition of SBC, in which he identifies that there is no real definition of SBC, but there's an accepted sales version of SBC, but part of it is accepted that it handles media and transcoding. Well, Kamailio itself does not do media. Okay, we partner very well with projects like RTP Engine and RTP Proxy, but Kamailio itself as a software does not do RTP. So therefore, some people will say, well, that means that Kamailio can't do SBC. So in order to not get into pedantics and arguments like that, I like to say we're a great SIP edge router. And so think of everything that an SBC can do without worrying about, out of the box transcoding or something, which again, you can do with RTP. But anyway, so what we can do here is load balancing, act as a security firewall, least cost routing. We can integrate with IMS and VoLTE, or VoLTE, however you want to say it. For a lot of, it's very popular in Europe and other areas where they're using Kamailio for mobile platforms and things like that. We can handle IM presence and much, much more. The most common deployment when you would use a SIP edge router is to just simply put it in front of your PBX or Class 5 or whatever media you want to have behind the edge. So I'd have my internet connection or whatever I'm doing as my WAN go into Kamailio. Kamailio would then act as my SIP edge router and only allow good traffic, proxy that, in this case, since we're at Astricon, to an asterisk. The good gets sent through, the bad gets rejected or ignored, and that's one of my favorite things with Kamailio that many of you have seen with Asterisk, is that even when I'm attacked, I'm sending a negative response. So if I'm trying to register a user, I'm going to send a 400, right? Which makes it hard to do that type of security alone with Asterisk. Is why we did API ban, so that you could block it in IP tables. But with Kamailio, we have the ability, based on whatever we'd like, to just simply ignore the message and not send a response, which really lets it excel at this kind of SIP edge routing. Some of those other aspects we can combine into, TLS is a performance killer, right? So if I want to do TLS communication, I really only need it at the edge. So I could have TLS to Kamailio and encrypted media to Kamailio, and then send that to my Asterisk via regular UDP and RTP. And that would allow me to handle many more calls on Asterisk, since I'm not doing that kind of, decryption and encryption. I can handle a lot more as UDP and have Kamailio just act as that bridge. And that same kind of bridging that we can do with SIP edge router is IPv6 to IPv4. Keep your Kamailio as is, but now you need to add IPv6. All right, that's fine. Let Asterisk just stay IPv4 and let Kamailio handle that kind of bridging for you, as well as a WebSockets bridge. if you wanted that. So you could have WebRTC go into Camelio, and then by the time it gets to Asterisk, just do SIP. Again, one of my favorite aspects of it. With Camelio and load balancing, you know, just because you have one asterisk doesn't mean that you'll have enough, and we'll get into that in just a second with scaling. So I might have multiple asterisks, and this could be because I'm limiting it maybe by function, so I have one as a queue, or one as a voicemail, maybe one as just regular calls, or I might have company A, company B, company C, you know, if I'm doing not multi-tenant or something like that. Those calls could come into Camelio, and Camelio would send it where it needs to go with dispatching or load balancing. If I'm doing load balancing where I can have asterisks handle a lot of load, well then that's where Camelio detects that one is down, removes that from the pool, and sends it to the other two. So it's seamless to the caller, but the call still works. Some of the modules that are specific to how we achieve SIP edge routing, and these are just selected because again we have 200 plus modules. I'm trying to go a little quick to make up one for some of the time, as well as leave time for questions. So if I'm going too fast on anything, please. You know, we're casual here, so you can just yell or something. Pike module, it's been there for at least 15 years, a little bit more. What this is doing is it's tracking connections by IP.
Yeah, I've been looking at that.
So just because I have a good client that's successfully authenticated doesn't mean that they've been compromised. And they're now coming in and attacking, right? So they're sending you know, 200 calls per second where you know, that your system or whatever isn't gonna allow that. That's just not allowed from a specific client. So you can handle that type of rate limiting with Pike and say, okay, no one is allowed to send me more than 200 calls per second, period. I'm gonna automatically block it. And just, it's set it and forget it. You control exactly how that's gonna be, so you can say how many packets I'm gonna accept within what time frame and handle it from there. It is a global setting. There's another feature called sec filter, and we used to do a lot of things manually, but sec filter is a module that combines a lot of our testing together, and it allows block or allow lists specifically based on user agent, IP address, country, domain, user, destination, and also does SQL injection. Okay, and there is a ton of SQL injection out there in SIP. If any of you have just run SNGrep and watched your SIP traffic, it's phenomenal how much, how lovely the internet has become over the course of time, right? So here we have some security without a module, just by using core Camelio. What this says, Camelio uses its own scripting language, but I'm going to get into something else in a little bit, but by default it uses its own scripting language that kind of makes sense to anyone that does any kind of scripting in any language. But what this says is if the user agent is like Friendly Scanner, which everyone should know, SIP CLI, SIP Vicious, back SIP user agent, etc., I am just going to exit. I see that there, I'm going to drop it. Nothing happens. They don't get a response, they don't get anything. Some people instead want to send an OK. If you're running, for example, a lot of TCP connections, there's some aspects where sending that OK might be beneficial to you because it will close that TCP connection and therefore help you reduce the impact of having an attack of too many connections of SIP scanner or something like that. If you're running UDP, just generally drop it. But that's an example of just using a user agent check. This one is just malformed SIP. The core of Camelio can detect if SIP is good. And so what this is saying is basically if my SIP message isn't very good, then I am going to log that I received a bad SIP message and I'm going to ignore it. I'm just going to ignore it. It wasn't good SIP. But the corollary here is, and there's another one that I'm not getting specifically into here, but the message had to be good enough where it was at least identified as SIP. And for some of the bad denial of service attacks that we had, I guess a year and a half ago or a year ago, at this time what we were seeing in the field is that people weren't sending SIP. They were sending, for example, DNS requests to port 5060, right? Because that could be amplified and things like that. That wouldn't be detected as SIP. That would be detected as something else, but we have another feature in Comet that can detect that non-SIP was received here and just drop that as well. For handling Pike, in this aspect, what we're going to say is, okay, I received too many connections from an IP, and I'm going to ban it and just exit. Okay, and so by default, in the Pike modules, it's a 4 seconds drop, but you can choose to handle that differently if you'd like. But it puts them in a timeout for 4 seconds, which in SIP is like a year. And then with that sec filter example, this one is just incredibly simple, but basically I want to check my user agent, my from, my to, and my contact fields, see if there's any SIP injection in there, and if there is, drop the message. I can do that with just that one command from that module. So that's a very broad example of handling Comet as a SIP edge router, but that also goes hand in hand with scaling. And you know, whether this is horizontal scaling or different types of scaling, the big question that you get in scaling when you start getting into it is users, right? And there's 2 ways of handling users. So Comet can be your registrar server. You could put just all users on Comet. Don't use Asterisk for any kind of user profiles or anything like that. That's my preferred way, but a lot of times that's not the way you can easily jump, because as Josh hinted with SwitchVox, anytime you make a change to how you've done things, it's a lot of work. And anytime you bring up a lot of work, you know, people by nature don't do it. So we try to delay the inevitable. And so what happens is that, hey, I have too many users and calls and everything running on my Asterisk. I need to try to improve performance. Some people will say, I'm having scaling problems. Well, you're not having scaling problems, you have growth problems. It's a good problem. You have too much to do on one box. So one of the ways that we can handle that was, instead of moving all your users away from Asterisk and creating, you know, a couple month solution for how we handle everything in terms of authentication and everything like that, we can try to offload some of that work that Asterisk is doing. One way is with a mid-registrar. And what a mid-registrar does is it starts taking these user registrations, Asterisk will still handle all the authentication and presence and everything like that, but instead of registering every minute because it's natted, Comet will handle that part and tell Asterisk, okay, I'm good, I'm not natted, just keep me for an hour. And Asterisk is like, sure. And then Asterisk performance goes way up, because instead of it having to do user checks every minute on a lot of users, it doesn't have to, and life is better for Asterisk, life is better for everyone. The considerations when you move away from that mid-registrar approach is that not only do you have user authentication to handle, but you're also going to have to figure out how to handle presence, future growth. There's a time and effort decision into all of these things, but you know, the phrase that I embraced is lo barato sale caro, which if you speak Spanish means the cheap becomes expensive. So I can pick the fastest and the cheapest solution, but down the road that's going to cost me more. Okay, so usually if I invest in a good roof for my house up front, it's going to be better than if I had to build 2 or 3 roofs down the road. So let's talk a little bit about how the mid-registrar works, and we've had this capability in Comet since 2010 with the UAC module. But basically a phone connects to Comet Comet sees the register, sends it over to the PBX, and it changes the port and the IP to itself. So as far as Asterisk is concerned, user is registering from Kamailio's IP, okay? And it also tells it, okay, my expiration now, instead of 60 seconds or 90 seconds or whatever it was there, is now an hour, for example. The PBX will, if hopefully, it will say, you know, we'll first send a 407, right, and then it'll go back and do it again. But eventually, if it's a good user, it will send a 200. Kamailio will keep track of that 200 that the user successfully authenticated. It is not learning the password, it's not learning anything like that, but you can keep track of that, that the 200 came okay, relays that 200, and then future registration attempts from that same user on that same port, Kamailio just says, okay, right? It doesn't need to send it back to Asterisk, doesn't need to do anything. It's keeping in track that this customer is alive. It's sent to that customer that same short registration time, so it's keeping that customer's firewall open, assuming that most customers are probably natted. You need to keep that firewall pinned open. And it's just exactly as it is. It's a middleman registrar, so mid-registrar. This uses the UAC module, but you can also use, as in the example I just kind of showed you, HTable, and do it yourself. And then you can combine this with bridging for TLS or WebSockets. So this was a really common aspect that we did in the last couple of years with the move to work at home, right? So you want to allow people to work at home. There's no way in anything you're going to spend the 10 hours that you need to get that customer's firewall working, so you just need to get something working for these people to work at home. Just switch them to TLS so you can have a little bit more security, have Kamailio act as that bridge to your local PBX. Works great. Other things that we can do for huge scaling, and when you start getting into large scale, I have a ton of calls, and I like the Hulk here because for comic book nerds out there, as the Hulk gets angrier, he gets bigger. So, comic book scaling. All right, we have a module in there called RTJSON. No, but what this does is when you send an API request, it has a format for the API to return that Kamailio can then handle the routing just from API. So I can handle all my routing and capabilities just by API, and that could include, for example, a failover route, or handle certain things. Since I'm handling it to an API, I can have that offload even CDRs or something like that. It could handle call logic, it could handle everything in whatever what programmer is doing it, so you don't have to say, okay, I really need to learn Kamailio and SIP and everything like that. You really don't. If you have really good development team in-house that builds really good and performant APIs, have that handle your business logic as well, and just have Kamailio respond to those responses from that API. The really good aspect of that is, for example, you had a centralized API, you can have Kamailios all over. Since you're having one centralized location handle those API requests, it knows that this customer has 3 calls here, 5 calls there, 7 calls here, and is doing that business logic based on how much they can handle, and it goes from there. So we would just handle that appropriately. LCR, Kamailio has several different modules that handle least cost routing, including failover and options, so that, for example, you could do it based on your client's needs, so that each SIP trunk is only allowed X amount of simultaneous calls, or each carrier only allows, let's say, 20 or 30 active connections. So I've reached that, so let me go to the next LCR or the next carrier, because even though this was my #1 choice, it's exceeded. That carrier is going to be mad if I send them traffic, since I'm already at the limit. So keep your carrier happy, which keeps your rates hopefully in a better place, and go from there. And most of those LCR modules also handle failover for when there is an error with the carrier or a bad situation and how to handle it, whether that be connectivity, carrier error, or user error. DMQ is a custom module within Kamailio that allows for Kamailio to share information, so it's our distributed message queue. Since Kamailio is designed to do SIP, we have a different method. So normally for those people that are looking at SIP packets, you might have register, invite, update, things like that. We have a method in there that we call KDMQ, and so Kamailio sees these methods and it handles that message. So whether it's updating information, updating user location, things like that. User location is phenomenal, so I could have multiple Kamailios accept user locations, and each Kamailio learns where the other user are. So I might register in California, I might have another client register in New York, and the SIP call for whatever reason went to New York. The New York server knows that that other user is registered in California. It sends the call to California to send it to that user. Or depending on whatever logic you have on that user end, you could send it directly from New York. Most firewalls don't like that, so you can just do the hop and go from there. The way that something like that would look would be here, where you have multiple SIP proxies in an East Coast, a West Coast. You have Kamailio acting as SIP edge router. As we've discussed in the first place, for both of those scenarios, it's using DMQ with each other so that each Kamailio knows everything that the other Kamailio knows, and together you achieve scaling horizontally as well as global high availability. So it's the piece de la resistance. But doing something like this is how we can exceed traffic, but it also allows Kamailio to go, you know what, this call came to me for whatever reason, but it really should go to the West Coast and go from there and just send it that way. So Kamailios can talk to each other. Some of the aspects that we can do to achieve this type of scaling is, one, the use of Anycast. So Anycast is how a lot of carriers are getting by it now. So I can just add servers as I need. They all have the same IP. And then we have other logic to figure out which of those entrance and exit nodes I need to use. Chemi is something that I talked about first, and when we talk about scaling, especially as we see the climate changing in terms of how difficult I hear from people that it is to find a software engineer that does VoIP, whether that be Kamailio, Astra, Cisco, whatever product you want. People complain that it's hard to get one. And Chemi is there in much the way that ARI is there, in theory, in that instead of having to learn complex dial plan syntax that, for example, Asterisk has or Kamailio might have, your next, Dan Jenkins said it best one year. He said your next telephone developer is a web developer. So, some people just understand the logic of their language. Chemi is an embedded language interface for Kamailio, so you can write all of your SIP logic in JavaScript, Lua, Python, Squirrel. I think those are the four that I know of. But again, with that other module, you can even just not write any logic and send it out to an API and come back in JSON. Although we do integrate with our own DMQ to talk to each other very well and keep state, sometimes that might not work with your other applications that may be needed. For example, a web interface or something else that's building off of real-time traffic. So you might want to integrate with Redis. I was just playing, I think a month ago, with some of the Redis, and I was actually blown away by how the connector can handle the traffic it did. I expected, I had started the test to prove that HTable was which is Kamailio's own internal memory table, was going to be so much more performant than connecting to Redis, and it wasn't. Redis was doing really, really well. I mean, it was better, but it wasn't significantly better where you should care. I was very, very impressed with the connector to Redis that Camellia has as just a default module, let alone doing it with an API. So I actually tested it 3 different ways. I tested HTable, which again, listed below is basically an internal Redis for Camellia, but it's a hash table that Camellia just keeps in memory, works on Power 2. It's phenomenal. And so I did HTable connector, I did Camelia's Redis module connector, and then I did an API call to something that updates Redis. The worst performant was the worst was still good, but it was the worst was an API call. The second best was Redis, and then insignificantly better was HTable. And then just to say that HTable isn't the solving of everything. I then had a scenario where we had to load 50 megabytes worth of data into a memory table. And yes, once it was in there, Camellia did really well with that HTable, but it took a very significant amount of time to load that data into Camellia for start. Whereas with Redis, you could do that simultaneously. So depending on the type of data that you need to store, there's a lot of times where I think that Redis might be a better application choice for you. And especially with that, you still achieve the same, multiple Camellias can still hit the same Redis box. So all things to consider with Redis. I know I talked quick. I apologize for that. I was trying to make up some time here to leave some time for questions and answers, which were ours. So I want to leave it with, we'd like to say in Camellia, thank you for flying Camellia. My contact info again is QXRK, so please feel comfortable in asking a question here. I've always found Astricon to be a decently friendly forum, so there's no stupid questions, and if so, I'm sure I'll make a stupid answer and you'll still look good. We have a conference in Berlin. It's going to be in person again this year, unless something drastically changes. So we'd love to see you in Berlin. That's me and my wife at the wall. Conference isn't at the wall, but when in Rome. But June 5th to 7th there's information there at CameliaWorld.com. Camellia is at camellia.org. And, I'm open for any questions that you have.
For guys have internal security for packets, right?
The question is, do we have internal security for packets?
Yeah.
How so?
If you do, does it work better than deep packet inspection as far as the efficiency?
All right, so I might be hearing the question wrong. So when we approach something with security, we first identified that it's SIP. So the first process that when a packet comes into Camellia is one, let's check is it SIP. Okay, if it is not SIP, our core parser will issue a rejection and just reject that aspect. So if I send DNS, for example, to Camellia, and Camellia runs in the application layer. So if I send a non-SIP packet to Camellia, it's going to just reject it. If I do send a SIP one, the next process is that it checks to see that that SIP is a valid SIP based on most RFCs, and you can fudge it because no one is RFC compliant, right? Just no one. So you can choose which ones you want to deal with, and then when you add a new carrier, you're going to have to change that. But so you can deal with how strict on the SIP protocol you want to be, like if you want to maintain that I'm not going to allow certain specific characters, things like that, and then handle it that way. And then once you've passed those 2 checks, at that point, it's up to you on how you want to implement the security for those packages.
I was just thinking that a company that has a system of deep packet inspection first and going through that might be inefficient, but it's whatever works best for the company.
So the recommendation that I have for most of my clients is that you not do a deep packet inspection of real-time,
Thank you.
either RTP and SIP. And then, yeah, and then we put that with Comilio. It will handle that same type of security for you, by only allowing those types of, packets through. And the problem that we have with doing, whether it's like on a Cisco SIP ALG, or, you know, Palo Alto, or any of the other ones, is that it delays it too much and the call's unusable, right? Because RTC happens in, you know, what, 20 milliseconds, or payloads and things like that happens too quick for those types of inspections to.
Oh, for the VLAN trunking, does that cause any issues with it? Or do you have to put it through just a separate switch?
So Comilio supports, different listening sockets, so I could have one on one VLAN, one on another, and do that parsing in Comilio itself, to handle your DMZ type of aspects, or, you can have that aspect work, in the network layer via, you know, whatever network equipment that you'd like.
Okay.
But you can have multiple, sockets, for listening, as well as, that type of, I see the next.
So you don't recommend hardware firewalls from Comilio?
I do recommend hardwall firewalls in front of Comilio. I don't recommend SIP inspection and RTP inspection in front of Comilios, but I would recommend, for example, you have something in front of Comilio blocking everything, let's say, other than the ports that you wanted to listen on for, you know, 5060, you know, 5061, whatever, you know, your RTP ports, all those aspects. But whether that's, you know, the most common we do is with, you know, Cisco products, so, you know, firewall there, or router, but, you know, Palo Alto, you know, everyone's favorite, you know, we should all.
They didn't
Sonic
publish
Wall
it,
everywhere. You know, so I do recommend, a hardware, you know, a hardware firewall in front of anything that's on the internet. But just port forward all of the SIP to Comilio.
We do the same thing for our Palo Altos,
Yeah.
and, you know, what I don't like about putting in front of a real time is that customer's gonna call you, says like, oh, I can't register, and you have like 30,000 registrations, where the hell, right? And how do you debug this? And it's invisible, and all of a sudden you find out your Palo Alto, or I'm not allowed to say name, whatever,
Yeah,
pick
no,
one.
Palo Alto, yeah.
Pick one, it's not Palo Alto issues, but it's, all of a sudden they're dropping that particular one because deep packet inspection thought that was not set.
Yeah.
You know, and all of a sudden you're having this 1% of your network, and you keep blaming the customer network because, well, it's your network, right? And I have, look at this, I have like 50,000 registrations, perfectly fine, and you, Mr. Customer, is your problem. So the customer gets bad experience, they say quit on you, they cancel the contract. And then later on you find out, oh, this invisible thing in my network was actually dropping packets. So we, you know, have been bit by that twice, and since then.
The way that deep packet inspection normally works is it's gonna check a couple packets to see, is it legit, you know, is it really RTP, is it something like that? And then you have robotic, you never recover from that, right? So in essence, it works for TCP type of communication and web really well, but not for.
You get a DDoS attack type of thing. Like,
So on a normal DDoS attack, I mean, let's put in perspective here. So if we're talking about like some of those DDoSes that we saw like over the last few years, right? When it comes down to it, Comilio is software running on a normal Linux box that runs in the application layer, right? So I try to block anything that I see from that core parser error or something like that. I immediately try to block in IP tables, so that there's, so that I'm improving it by blocking it in the network layer instead of the software layer, for the OSI nerds, which everyone is, right? You know, so it just makes it more efficient in that aspect. But and there's if you go to qxrk.com or contact me, there's an open source API that Comilio can integrate with, that will automatically block it in IP tables for you, which is neat. But at the same aspect, some of the ones that we saw hitting major carriers were, you know, hundreds of gigs of packets per second. By that time, you know, Kamailio is fine because it's never making it there, right? It's fried everything north of it. So, you know, it's it's fried the firewalls, it's fried everything, and most of those systems aren't handling it. So on a true DDoS, you need a layered approach where Kamailio is a first responder because it might be seeing it first, but it's not gonna be handling a true DDoS attack. You're gonna need good network equipment, good network software.
The bigger pipe.
Yeah, and that's where distributed load, things like that might help. What we see is where Kamailio helps with those types of situations is, I'm getting off on a tangent here, but where Kamailio helps with those things is, for example, user location, right? So if Kamailio is acting as a mid-registrar or a user location registrar, Kamailio can keep track of the IPs, right? So it's a lot easier to get those IPs from Kamailio or to update as they are saving in real time in, let's say, an H table or Reddit of these are the IPs that are connected to me. I'm now experiencing a DDoS attack. Okay, I'm sorry everyone that isn't registered as of now, but I'm now turning this list of IPs into an allow list. So anything other than my registered users and my known carriers is blocked, right? And just start rejecting that just to, is that gonna solve the problem? No, but it's gonna, you know, help, you know, hopefully put out a little bit of a fire until things are gonna go down. You're gonna anger some customers, but you're not gonna anger all customers, right? Which is what's gonna happen when you die in a DO denial of service anyway. But you're under attack, so you gotta start thinking that you're under attack and you know, there's gonna be some casualties. Yes, sir.
Yeah, the next presentation, great, that's good. I've got two questions.
Mhm.
Number one is, with Kamailio, does it have to be within my Astricon service network? Are they gonna be together in the same network, or Kamailio can be on a different network and my Astricon service can be in a different data center?
So the question is, does Kamailio have to be in the same network or not? No, it doesn't. So we do have some clients where they might put Kamailio, let's say for example, in the cloud, and then they have their Asterisk hosted locally. And instead, what they do, instead of having those Asterisks open to the world, they just have those Asterisks open to Kamailio, wherever that is. So I have my firewall security or my network security saying, okay, I'm not gonna accept any connections to the Asterisk unless it's from this outside network IP, and go from there. The majority of times, we do see either Kamailio on the same network as the Asterisk, or have at least a method of communicating with that same network, whether it's you know, 2 NICs or something like that, multi-NICs. And the second.
Thank you for that. Second one is, if I have a big server, can I have Kamailio and Astricon server on the same server? Is it possible?
All right, can you run Asterisk and Kamailio on the same server? Absolutely. I hate it, but yes, you can, absolutely. And a lot of people do it. I really like, because it's so small and lightweight, I would say if you have a server that's big enough to do that, I'd encourage you to maybe consider making that server a virtual host. Or, you know, running each one as a virtual server, or something like that. Some people, and I believe that there's talks here, do, you know, as Kubernetes or Dockers, and that might be an approach as well. I'm more into, let's say, making smaller servers that can handle that type of load, and only because of, one, the nightmare of troubleshooting is much easier when they're separate processes, which kind of can work on the same box. But the bigger issue I have on when they share the same box is that, you know, one issue can affect now multiple software applications running on that same box, since both of these are going to run in the application.
Thank you.
In the back.
Yeah, So, say you've got like a cluster of Astra servers, and you're putting Camellia in front. Do you suggest, if you're doing registration and present TLF, you have like a second Camellia instance, or just doing the present stuff, separating the registration, present data?
All right, so the question is, let's say I have a cluster of asterisks and I've smartly decided to make users just on Camellia. Should I have another Camellia do presence? I love that. So normally, in my ideal world, yes. The reason for is because Camellia, again, is open source. Everyone here gets free licenses. It's an old joke, but I mean, you can run as many of these as you want, right? So not only do I want, at least those servers, I'll probably want a couple more just for high availability. But I would much rather have multiple servers with a dedicated function than one server trying to do everything. Because then when I get to scaling, it's a lot easier to handle that. It's more complex to build it this way, but as I grow, and our problem should be that our whatever we're building becomes much bigger than what we want. If you're saying, oh, it could be that, oh, look, I bought somebody else and now I'm bigger again. Or it could be that, that you just had a successful marketing campaign and these 100 users that you were expecting turned into 1,000. Or the usage of your users is way higher than what you expected. So I think if you build in the aspect of component-based and modular-based, it allows you to scale should that problem happen much easier. The negative, of course, is it's harder to build and it's more complex when you're just starting out. It's really very complex for the one call that you're putting through, but when you start having thousands of them, it's a godsend, and you're very grateful to yourself for doing it the right way. But that truly, to me, is the best way of going, as well as when you decide that, hey, there might be something better out there, then, even though we're using Camellia presence here, what if we just turn that into an API service? Okay, well, you can just switch that out and you're not affecting this aspect. So right hand and left hand can move independently. Any other question? I know we're coming right at the hour mark here. Seems only like 5 minutes. So. No.
Last question. Can you describe how RTP Engine is involved and you do need to handle the audio of the products? I'm really confused by that. Like, how does the STP, for example, get
Sure. So the question is, RTP Engine. Tell me about it. So RTP Engine is all right. This is the last question. I'm stretching it out. So RTP Engine is a separate module. Camellia tells it, okay, it came in from here, use your public interface or use your private interface. RTP Engine then just handles it from there on, and it goes from there. But you will pass through Camellia when the call is being set up. If you wanted a specific IP address, or RTP Engine itself can just pick up based on the interface that it came in on, what IP address it should use for that media. It will handle the replacement in the SDP, so that this side sees the public IP, this side sees the private IP, and everybody's happy. This side sees SRTP, this side sees just regular RTP.
So is it a back-to-back user agent at that point?
No, because same call ID, same certain aspects. All right, with that, I'm afraid my time is up. I thank you so much for having me here.